Hello, everybody. Welcome to our second module that deals with language, the world of words. You've already been exposed to how language can powerfully shape what we think, what our cultures are. It's changed humanity. We're very different than Neanderthals, that's for sure. And this week, we're going to get a little more focused on what these outcomes are from using language and look at more of the specific features of language. And then we're going to look at how that applies to making our communication more effective. So there's quite a bit here. The information for this presentation draws from my own experience in teaching, but the conceptual framework I've largely drawn from Julia Wood's book, Interpersonal Communication, Everyday Encounters. It's just a great book. And you have the PDF copy of the chapter if you'd like more depth and more explanation than what I'm going to give here in this presentation. And with that, what I want to make sure of before we get going is that you've done the quiz that's listed at the top of the modules. I want you to review the information from several of the last few chapters because the course is cumulative, which means that the ideas, they build on each other. So the goal is to bring all this information together so that you have a really fantastic new set of tools to communicate, be a really effective communicator. So make sure you did that. And once you've done that, come on back to the presentation. We're now going to talk about the symbolic nature of language. Language is a symbol system. So what does that mean, a symbol system? Well, symbols represent something else, yeah? It's not the thing itself. So when I do this, some of you, if you are from World War II, would say, oh, that's the victory symbol, right? But then those of you from the 60s will say, well, that's the peace sign, and people are still using it as a peace sign. So a symbol stands for something, but it's not the thing. Hayakawa used to say that the map is not the territory. So the words are not the thing, they represent the thing. And we have, here's a number of symbols on this, in the photo that I have here, right? Some characteristics of symbols that make it challenging for us, okay? Symbols are arbitrary, symbols are ambiguous, and symbols are abstract. So what do we mean by that? Well, let's take a look at each of these features of language. Symbols are arbitrary. That means that the names that we give objects, they have no basis in the nature of the object itself. There is nothing intrinsic in the word stop that made us say stop. And the Spanish language uses the word alto. So that's a stop sign from Mexico. They both mean the same thing, and one isn't more right than the other. We just arbitrarily pick these different words. So all of us with different languages around the world, we have different words with different sounds. And one's not more right than the other. It's just we arbitrarily pick these words to represent these things or these concepts or these places or these people. And we could have chosen any word, but we have the ones that we chose, and we all are taught them so that we can share a common system, and that's what facilitates communication. Ambiguous is the next feature of it. So ambiguous means it's not that clear. It's kind of fuzzy. And here's an example. A couple of guys are talking about fish. So one says, I love fish, and the other one says, I do too. So it sounds like they're talking about the same thing. Yeah, it's the same word, but take a look here, okay? When the first guy says, I love fish, he's talking about the meal that you can make with fish, a cooked fish, okay? The other guy is talking about his aquarium. You know, he loves having fish and taking care of them and looking at them. Totally different, yeah, but it's the same word. So that's what I mean by ambiguous. There can be different meanings for these words, and that makes it challenging. the last feature, that language is abstract, means that it's taken away from the concrete and brought up to a level that is more general and conceptual. So the more conceptual the word, the more abstract and the more possibility for people meaning something different by it, okay? So the variance of words, it can vary across people and across cultures. And then once you put a label on something, that's something we saw last week, is that once we label something, it can be totalizing, and we'll tend to see things through that label and not see other features of it. So here's an example, okay? The word love. Love is a word that's universal. Every culture uses it, but people mean different things by the word love. And here's an example from a psychologist in the US who's written about this. He's written actually a very famous book that I recommend called The 5 Languages of Love. Okay, so there's 5 ways that he found that people express love. One is affirmation. So you could say to a person, your coffee is delicious. So you're showing the person that you love them by saying affirming things to them. A second way to share love is an act of service. So you can make somebody coffee. That would show them that you love them. Another is to receive a gift from a person. So someone could go out and get you a coffee, and you would know they cared about you. They loved you if they did that. And then for some people, spending time together is how you express love. So let's go get a coffee together. That's quality time. And then the last is physical touch. So let me hold you like a coffee. Yeah, so people express love in different ways depending on how they were raised. And it's a word that's shared across all cultures, and yet it can have different meanings for different people. So that's what we mean by abstract. Now here's a discussion question for you. So I want you to stop the presentation to go to the discussion question. And this discussion question is on the symbolic nature of language. So go ahead and do that so that you can check your understanding on the symbolic nature of language, and then come on back to the presentation. Some principles of verbal communication. Language and culture reflect each other. So while different cultures have different words for things and they may have different meanings, the language that people use in that culture to describe things then shapes the way people will see things. And then that reproduces the culture. Each child born in that culture is going to see things in the way that their language has influenced them to see things, right? So there's this mutual kind of reflection, the language reflecting the culture and the culture reflecting the language. The meanings of language are subjective. So we could have, like I showed you that word love and all the different ways that could be interpreted, and there could be other cultures that have even more interpretations of love, yeah? So it's subjective, it's what I think about it. And it's shared, it's subjective, but it's also shared with other people in your culture. And then another feature of language is that there's rules about it, okay? And rules apply in 2 different ways. There's rules that are called regulative rules, which determine how you use the language. And then there's constitutive rules, which is what means what, okay? So an example for a regulative rule that a lot of people were talking about last week with the debate, a regulative rule is that you're not supposed to interrupt, right? You're supposed to take your turn and let the other person take their turn. So that would be a regulative rule that's pretty common across a lot of cultures, to do turn taking, and that's how you use the language, okay? A constitutive rule is what constitutes what makes up what, right? So if I'm talking and somebody starts talking while I'm talking and then takes over the floor, takes over the conversation, that equals an interruption. Okay, so that's a constitutive rule. What equals an interruption? When someone starts talking while I'm talking and then takes over the conversation, that is a constitutive rule, right? Okay, so those are the 2 types of rules that we see with language. And then there's another feature of language, is that which is that punctuation shapes meaning. So I'm going to show you a new slide for that because it's complex and I want you to see more detail on it. Okay, so punctuation is what do you focus on? Okay, so when we see a whole bunch of words and we see a period, we know that we take a pause after that sentence and then go on to the next sentence. Yeah, and commas do the same thing, the punctuation. As you're reading, if there's a comma, you take a little pause and then you continue reading the sentence. Yeah, so punctuation is what draws your attention in the conversation. Okay, so this is a very common pattern that happens in relationships and how people see the situation differently. Okay, so there's something that's called the demand withdraw pattern. Okay, so I'm going to start at the top. I withdraw because you pursue me. Okay, I don't like how much you're pursuing me. That's too much. Okay, so then the next person, that's we're having this interaction with, pursues even harder because that person withdrew. Okay, and so then they're withdrawing because you're pursuing even harder, and then you pursue because of the withdrawal. Yeah, so what you pay attention to. So one person is paying attention to the fact that they're being pursued, and then the other person is paying attention to the fact that that other person is withdrawing. So if I were to diagram that, okay, so the points at the bottom would be what the one person's paying attention to, these acts of pursuit. That's what they're seeing in the interaction. Okay, the other person is seeing the withdrawal. Okay, which then makes them want to pursue even more. Okay, so the withdrawing person focusing on the withdrawing is seeing these points of the interaction. So what this line represents is just an ongoing series of interactions. But what the little red dot represents is the punctuation, what each one is paying attention to. So that happens in language, that people punctuate the stream of language in different ways, not only with the symbols of punctuation like periods and question marks, but in terms of what do they pay attention to when there's an interaction. So now I want you to go to the discussion question 2 in this module, and that's going to be about punctuation. And I want you to look at a situation where you and someone else punctuated it differently. And when you're done with that, come on back to the presentation. Now we move to looking at some of the abilities that language has or gives us as the users of language. So one is that language defines phenomena. So it actually shapes what we see. It can be totalizing. So once we put that label on something, then we tend to keep on seeing the situation in that same way, and it's hard for us to see it in a different way. Okay, and then it shapes and reflects relationships. So how people talk to each other, it helps to create the relationship the way it's going to be, and that it also reflects the relationship. Okay, so if I'm talking to a person, let's say I'm talking to the college president who has a lot of power and authority over me, right? I'm going to talk to that person very respectfully. I'm not going to make sarcastic jokes when I'm speaking to the president and so on. So because that relationship is one where I am being deferent to that person who I respect in my hierarchy at work. Yeah, so it's the way I'm talking, being deferent. It reflects the relationship, but it also shapes it. So if the president had never seen me before, and rather than being deferent and respectful, I started making sarcastic remarks about things that I don't like about our university, that would create a different type of relationship. Yeah, probably one with tension, but it would be very different than with me being a respectful person towards that authority. Yeah, so it shapes and it reflects the relationship. And the abilities that language gives us is that we can define things. We can also evaluate things. What's good, bad, right, wrong, preferred, dispreferred, and so on. We evaluate. We give things labels with those evaluations, okay? It also helps us organize things, put things into categories, yeah? And that's helpful in trying to engage in processes, right? So you have to put things into categories, and then we have these processes that we can engage in. And that's what allows us as humans to engage in very complex activities and build organizations and do things that animals that don't have language are incapable of doing. And then it allows for hypothetical thought. So that's saying, what if, right? So it lets us plan, it lets us think about the future, it lets us create ideas about things that we possibly could do. And then as a result of those ideas, we pursue things that it generates goals and allows us to be productive with our lives. Then the last is on this list, there's more. The last on this list is self-reflection. So self-reflection is when you are able to take a look at yourself and look at what you're doing, how you're conducting yourself. You're able to look at how you're affecting other people. So with communication, it's really good to try to see how your communication is affecting other people and to think, well, is that the effect that I want to have? And if it's not, you might want to shift and try something different. And if it is, then you would continue that behavior. So self-reflection allows us to do that. The fact that it evaluates, okay, it reflects and it shapes our perceptions of situations. So we saw last week an example where if a person kept on asking lots and lots of questions at a meeting, that some people might perceive that person as self-centered, and then they would start perceiving everything that person did as being self-centered. But instead, if you were to think of her as being insecure or just a novice that needs a lot more information than a person that's been doing it for a long time, it would allow you to see the situation in a very different way. So when we say that it's loaded, the words that we use can, because it influences how we see things, it can have a very powerful effect on folks. Yeah. And then language can be used to degrade other people. And so this is one of the unfortunate things about language. And people get put into in-groups and out-groups, and people tend to treat the people in the in-group, the group that they're in, better than the people in the out-group. And this is the cause of a lot of the world's hostilities and violence and serious problems. And we are dealing with those problems in the United States right now. Huge problems with this, yeah? Now, we did talk about this before as well, because we talked about perception, but now we're looking at how the language influences the perception, right? So language allows for abstract thought. So we're able to think of categories rather than just a single thing that's right there in front of our face, okay? But that, on the negative side, that's what allows us to stereotype. And so stereotyping can be a serious problem, particularly when we're wrong about our stereotypes and when our stereotypes about folks are negative. But as we saw in the perception chapter, stereotypes allow us to make predictions so that we don't have to constantly think through a whole situation every time we're faced with a situation. We don't have to start from scratch as if we'd never seen it before. It allows us to guide our decision-making and our actions. But a lot of times our stereotypes are wrong, and if they're negative, particularly about people, then they're problematic. The fact that language allows for hypothetical thought, this means that we can think beyond the immediate and concrete situation. So we live in 3 dimensions of time. We can think about the past, the present, and the future all during this, as you know, within a 5-minute session, yeah? And we do that constantly as humans. We think about the past, we reminisce, or we look for ideas from our past to guide us in our present, and then also to help shape our future. And the fact that we are able to engage in this hypothetical thought and think about different places and times and so on, this can foster personal growth because it helps us to think about where do we want to go, what do we want to do, and make plans for ourselves and set goals and achieve our goals. Without hypothetical thought, the goals are just very, very immediate, like see prey in front of me, go chase it, kill it, eat it. That's about it. Yeah. But with hypothetical thought, I can think about building my career, going to school to get my concepts and skills and my expertise so I can get a good job in my field and build my career. Yeah. So hypothetical thought allows us to do complex things that we could not do without language. The self-reflection, as I said, is really important. It allows us to think about what we're doing, see how we're affecting people, and seeing if we're getting the results we want and making changes when we're not. And that hypothetical thought, when we combine it with that, with the self-reflection, when we see things that we want to change, we can pull out of the hypothetical thought ideas about what we could do differently to have a better effect, whatever it is that we're trying to do, okay? And self-reflection allows us to manage our image. And we live in a time right now when people are so incredibly image conscious, thanks to the camera and now thanks to the selfie, you know, with these phones we carry around and all these, the things that we post on our social media and so on. We're so conscious about our image in a way that we haven't been so conscious in the past. Now, people that share ideas and they share common ways of talking and interacting are called a speech community by people that study speech communities, which could be anthropologists, could be communication people. And speech community exists when people share norms about how to talk and what purposes our talk serves. And it's defined by the shared understandings of how to communicate rather than by just countries or geographic regions. So we're in the United States, which has lots and lots and lots of different speech communities, but we are not the only country with lots and lots of different speech communities. In Nigeria, where I have done some work, there's 19 different ethnic groups and languages. And people think very differently across those, and they have some conflict amongst some of those groups that has led to a lot of violence, which is really sad. But here in this country, I'm sure you belong to some groups where you have your own kind of lingo, ways of talking to each other that is unique to your group. And you might connect with people in other parts of the world. I know that my nephew plays video games with people all over the world, and they know all the lingo of the video game and they talk about it. Yeah. Okay. So I know that you probably have quite a bit of experience with different, or at least one or two speech communities that you're involved in. So then we have the fact that gender often constitutes a speech community. So we're socialized into different gendered speech communities. So we get socialized by our parents, then school, and even the workplace. We get socialized by watching the media. So it tells us how to interact according to our gender. And so the different genders can have different ways of communicating. And Deborah Tannen, who wrote a bestseller about this, she wrote a book called You Just Don't Understand, and it explained differences between the way men and women communicate. Now, she's not alone. A lot of people were doing research on this before she wrote a bestseller. And what people that were studying the way that gender can constitute a speech community, they came out of anthropology that looked at how culture creates these different communities. And so these people got the idea that, hey, you know what? I think that men and women are kind of like two cultures in the way they interact. And so when that happens, there can be misunderstandings. So a major one that has been written about a lot is how when people start to vent about a situation, in most male speech communities, men think that what you need to do is solve the problem. The person's telling you a problem because they want a solution, and you got to tell the person how to solve it. And in women's speech communities, a lot of women's communities, I'm not going to say all of them, when women talk about a problem, then they're just trying to get their feelings out and they want to be understood. They don't want you to solve it. They just want to feel connection, right? So this leads to a lot of tension, especially if you know, man and woman are in a relationship and the woman's talking about some issues at work and the man keeps telling her what to do, and it's like she doesn't want that. She just wants to be understood. And he's thinking like, well, I just gave you a whole bunch of solutions. Like, why don't you just do them? Yeah. So that's an example of a kind of misunderstanding that can arise from being socialized differently and having different goals in communication and different ideas about what's supposed to happen. Social media has created its own kind of rules and ways of communicating. So, and it has also given rise to new words. Like there wasn't the word text me when I was growing up. Yeah, there were no text messages. So, and just like verbal communication, then social media also has regulative and constitutive rules. So what equals what? A regulative rule is what constitutes something. So an example is that you're supposed to, say in text messaging, you shouldn't be using all caps. So that's a regulative rule, is to use small letters unless, you know, it's the beginning of a sentence or a proper noun. Don't use all caps, because what? If you use all caps, it's seen as you're screaming at somebody. So the constitutive rule is that caps equal yelling or screaming or increasing the volume, intensity of what you're saying. It's supposed to be an emotional kind of expression, right? So the regulative is like, don't do it. And then the constitutive is, oh, this is what it is. So you probably know lots of other areas of this from social media because you're the generation that's using it more than my generation. Okay, so some guidelines for improving verbal communication. This is from earlier this semester. We talked about engage in dual perspectives. So always when communicating to be effective, you want to try to bear in mind both your own perspective and the perspective of the other person with whom you're communicating. So that is a dual perspective. So keep that in mind for the rest of your life, okay? That makes communication much more effective. And another guideline for having effective communication is to own your feelings and thoughts when you talk to people, particularly when you are articulating something that's bothering you or concerning you, or if you're having a conflict with somebody. And that's known as I language rather than you language, when you take responsibility for what you feel by saying I instead of you. So in this chart, we see a comparison to you language and I language. So the you language is, you make me nervous on the job. The I language would be, when you watch me work, I feel nervous. So you see the difference there? So the first one, you make me nervous on the job. It's putting the locus of control. Remember we talked about locus of control in the other person, like they can control how you feel. So people can't control how you feel, but we do influence each other. So this behavior, when you watch me work, I feel nervous. So notice another feature of this statement here. When you watch me work, okay, how more concrete it is rather than abstract. So we were talking a while back about the ladder of abstraction, and then we talked about the ladder of inference. Yeah, so the more abstract, the more likely it is for people to misunderstand it, and then for the generalization to be rather global. So notice how this is much more concrete. When you watch me work, I feel nervous. Okay, you hurt me. Again, blaming that person like they have that ability and they did it to you. Okay, so here it's much more specific. I feel hurt when you ignore what I say. And it would be even better if you could talk about how did that person ignore you, when they just change the subject. Did they walk away? Did they crack a joke? The more specific and concrete, the better the message, okay? You make me feel small, all right? So here, the person says, I feel small when you tell me that I'm selfish. So that's very concrete. It's telling them exactly what they said that made them have that feeling. Okay, you're so domineering. When you shout, I feel dominated. Okay, so this, it sounds like the person's always dominating, always, but this is very specific. When you shout, I feel dominated. Okay, then here, you humiliated me, can be changed to I feel humiliated when you mention my problems in front of our friends. So that's so much more specific. And I think it speaks to something that would make many people feel uncomfortable. Yeah, to be, when someone's problems are being told to other people without them having decided they wanted that to happen. Okay. So here's some more guidelines. That last page was on just how to use I statements or I messages, I language. This one is a few other tips. Respect what others say about their feelings and thoughts. Remember that everyone perceives things differently. So we saw that with the perception chapter. So you might not have the same perception, but that doesn't mean that you can't understand or accept that someone could have a different perception. So remember, we have different perceptions, and accept when someone says they perceive something a certain way, accept that that's what they feel. With your own communication, strive for accuracy and clarity. The more concrete you are, the easier it is for people to get what you're trying to tell them, okay? So be aware of the levels of abstraction. So don't forget the ladder of inference or the ladder of abstraction. The lower you get on the ladder, the more concrete, the easier it's going to be for people to understand what you're talking about. And then you want to qualify language, and by giving the specific examples that what you're saying applies to, okay? So a static evaluation is something that's static, like somebody always is something. So that previous one, like you are domineering, it's as if they're always domineering, whereas what the actual situation was that person felt that when they were raising their voice or yelling at them. So be careful about the static evaluation. Is this, if it applies to that person at all times, it's static and unchanging, okay? So mental indexing is making a note of when things happen and being able to be specific about applying your evaluations and how you're describing things, okay? So take note of that, and take note of how you're looking at things, okay? So that is the end of this presentation, and I look forward to meeting with you in class this week, because we're going to do a lot more work with the I language, which is so important. And that's why there's another video that's specifically, it's short, it's only 10 minutes, specifically on using I statements. Okay, see you in class. Bye-bye. All right, so we're at the end of the content part of the conversation, and you just have one thing left connected to the presentation, which is the quiz. So it's the M6 quiz, quiz 2, which is on the world of words. So this is going to be a quiz on the content of this presentation. In class this week, I'm really looking forward to seeing you, because we are going to be working on the I language, and I want you to watch that video that I've posted that I got on YouTube. That's Dr. Judy's short presentation, only 10 minutes, on I statements, and she's done a great job with it. So I'd really like you to watch it and look at the 5 components of I statements that Dr. Judy puts out, because it's just much more detailed than what we could get from Julia Wood's book. Okay, so I look forward to seeing you again, and this is going to be a great exercise that we're going to be doing in class today. It's going to be so helpful. This changes people's lives, knowing these skills. All right, take care.